The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors. The Miracle off Samar. The Hook. The horizon did not look right. It was October 25th, 1944, just after dawn, and the Philippine Sea should have been empty. But for the sailors aboard the USS Johnston, a small Fletcher-class destroyer bobbing in the swells off the coast of Samar, the horizon was suddenly crowded with nightmares. These were not the friendly silhouettes of the U.S. Third Fleet. These were the pagoda-style masts of the Imperial Japanese Navy. And they weren't just ships. They were the center force, the most powerful surface fleet Japan had left, led by the colossal Yamato, the largest battleship ever built in human history. The Yamato alone weighed more than all the American ships in this sector combined. The American unit, known by the call sign Taffy 3, was never meant to fight a surface battle. They were a support unit of small, slow escort carriers and thin-skinned destroyers, tin cans the sailors called them, tasked with protecting ground troops, not fighting battleships. They had no armor, their guns were too small to penetrate the enemy's hulls, and their top speed was slower than the enemy's cruising speed. Facing them were 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. It was a mathematical impossibility. It was a death sentence. And yet, over the loudspeaker of the USS Johnston, Commander Ernest E. Evans, a rugged Cherokee Creek warrior from Oklahoma, did not sound afraid. He sounded resolved. His voice crackled over the ship's intercom with a chilling order that would echo through naval history. A large Japanese fleet has been contacted. They are 15 miles away and headed in our direction. They are believed to have 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and destroyers. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can. The onslaught. The premise of the battle was a catastrophic intelligence failure. The main striking force, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, had been lured away to the north by a Japanese decoy fleet, leaving the landing beaches at Leyte Gulf completely exposed. The only thing standing between the massive Japanese center force and thousands of vulnerable American transport ships and troops on the beach was Taffy 3. If the Japanese broke through, they could massacre the American landing force and prolong the war by years. The Japanese admiral, Takeo Kurita, spotted the small American carriers and assumed they were the main fleet. He ordered a general attack. At 6:58 a.m., the Yamato opened fire. The sound was not a bang, it was a geologic event. The 18-inch guns hurled shells weighing as much as a compact car across nearly 20 miles of ocean. Great geysers of water, dyed distinct colors by the Japanese to spot their fall of shot, erupted around the tiny American carriers. The Americans were running for their lives, launching aircraft as fast as they could, turning into the wind and fleeing south. But they couldn't outrun the Japanese cruisers. Someone had to stay behind. Someone had to die to buy time. The charge of the Johnston. Without waiting for orders, Commander Evans on the Johnston made a decision that defied all logic of survival. He ordered his ship to turn around. While the rest of the fleet fled, the Johnston turned directly toward the entire Japanese fleet. It was a single 2,100-ton destroyer charging into the teeth of 300 tons of enemy warships. The Johnston zigzagged through the water, dodging shells that splashed so close they washed sailors overboard. Evans waited until he was within 10,000 yards, point-blank range in naval terms, to fire his torpedoes. The target was the heavy cruiser Kumano. The Johnston unleashed a spread of 10 torpedoes and immediately turned back into its own smokescreen. Moments later, underwater explosions rocked the Kumano, blowing off its bow. The Japanese line faltered. A single American destroyer had just crippled a heavy cruiser. But the retribution was swift. As the Johnston emerged from the smoke, she was hit by 3 14-inch shells from a battleship and 3 6-inch shells from a light cruiser. The damage was catastrophic. The engine room was a wreck, speed was cut in half, and the bridge was decimated. Commander Evans lost 2 fingers on his left hand and had his shirt blown off by the blast, his torso peppered with shrapnel. Yet he refused to leave the bridge. He wrapped a handkerchief around his mangled hand and continued to shout orders. The wolves attack. Evans' suicidal bravery inspired the rest of the screen. The other destroyers, the USS Hull and the USS Heermann, along with the smaller destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, was even smaller than the Johnston. It was designed to hunt submarines, not trade fire with cruisers. Copeland told his crew, "This will be a fight against overwhelming odds, from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." The Sammy B, as the crew called her, charged a heavy cruiser, firing her small 5-inch guns so rapidly that the gun barrels overheated. They had to be cooled with water from a fire hose. For an hour, the tiny ship fought like a battleship, blowing out the bridge of the heavy cruiser Chokai and setting her ablaze. The scene became a chaotic melee of smoke, rain, and fire. The American ships were so close to the enemy that the Japanese battleships couldn't depress their massive guns low enough to hit them. The Heermann actually engaged the battleship Haruna, then the Yamato itself, forcing the giant ship to turn away to avoid torpedoes. For a few critical minutes, the Yamato, the pride of Japan, was effectively chased away by a single destroyer. The Air War. While the tin cans fought on the surface, the sky above was filled with desperate heroism. The planes from the Taffy 3 carriers had launched with whatever they had. Some had torpedoes, some had depth charges meant for submarines, some had nothing at all. Pilots flew into the teeth of intense anti-aircraft fire to drop depth charges on battleship decks, hoping the concussion would rattle the crews. When they ran out of ammunition, they didn't return to base. They flew dry runs, diving at the Japanese ships to force them to take evasive maneuvers, delaying their advance. Avenger pilot Lieutenant J.G. Thomas Lupo, having expended all his ammunition, made repeated strafing runs on a Japanese destroyer with nothing but the intimidation of his engine noise, leaning out of his cockpit to fire his service revolver at the ship below. It was an act of pure defiance. The tragedy. Despite the heroism, the physics of the battle began to take their toll. The Hull, trapped by battleships, was blown out of the water, her crew firing until the decks awash. The Samuel B. Roberts, having fired almost all its ammunition, took 3 massive hits from a battleship's 14-inch guns. The impact tore the ship open like a tin can. As the ship began to sink, the crew, many weeping with rage and exhaustion, abandoned ship. The Johnston, now a floating wreck, was surrounded. Japanese destroyers circled her like sharks. Commander Evans, barely standing, ordered the ship abandoned. As the Japanese destroyer Yukikaze sailed past the sinking Johnston, the Japanese captain was seen on the bridge saluting the American ship, a rare sign of respect for an enemy who had fought with the spirit of a samurai. Commander Evans was never seen again. He would posthumously receive the Medal of Honor. The miracle. By 9 a.m., the situation was hopeless. The American escorts were sinking or burning. The carriers were taking hits. The Japanese fleet was closing in for the kill. The way to Leyte Gulf was open. And then the impossible happened. Admiral Kurita ordered a retreat. The ferocity of the American counterattack had confused the Japanese. The smokescreens, the aggressive destroyers, and the swarm of buzzing aircraft convinced Kurita that he was not fighting a small escort unit, but the main carrier force of the U.S. Navy. He believed he was sailing into a trap. He had lost 2 heavy cruisers, and his fleet was scattered. Exhausted and fearing heavy air attacks, he turned his massive fleet around and headed north. The sailors of Taffy 3, floating in the oil-slicked water or standing on the burning decks of their carriers, watched in disbelief as the pagoda masts faded back over the horizon. They had done the impossible. A handful of destroyers and escort carriers had turned back the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled. The aftermath. The cost was high. Over 1,000 Americans died. Taffy 3 lost 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and a destroyer escort. But they had saved the Leyte landing force. They had inflicted greater losses on the Japanese center force than they had sustained. In the days that followed, the survivors floating in the ocean faced sharks, dehydration, and exposure due to delayed rescue operations. When they were finally pulled from the sea, they were oil-soaked, sunburned, and emaciated, but they carried with them the story of the greatest mismatch in naval history. The battle off Samar is not just a story of war, it is a testament to the sheer force of human will. It proved that in the face of certain death, when the math says you have 0 chance of survival, the spirit of the fighter can still alter the course of history. As Admiral Halsey later said, the plain truth is that the Taffy 3 pilots and the destroyermen wrote a page in our history that will live forever. The tin can sailors had fought the giants, and against all odds, the giants had blinked.
The silence that descended on the Philippine Sea after Admiral Kurita's fleet retreated was almost more terrifying than the noise. For over 2 hours, the air had been ripped apart by the scream of 18-inch shells, the roar of burning aviation fuel, and the desperate chatter of anti-aircraft fire. Now there was only the sound of men shouting, the hiss of steam escaping from ruptured pipes, and the groaning of dying ships. But for the sailors of Taffy 3, the war was not done with them yet. Just as the adrenaline began to fade and the crews of the surviving escort carriers started to assess their shattered decks, a new low-pitched drone emerged from the north. It was 10:50 a.m., barely an hour after the Japanese battleships had turned away. The radar screens, cluttered with the ghosts of the morning's chaos, failed to give adequate warning. 5 Japanese Zero fighters plummeted out of the clouds. These pilots were not flying with the tactical precision of the morning's attackers. They were flying with a terrifying finality. This was the debut of the Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the special attack unit, known to the West as the Kamikaze. 1 Zero, trailing smoke, dove straight for the USS St. Lo. The American gunners poured lead into the plane, shredding its wings, but the pilot did not pull out. He crashed through the flight deck, his bomb detonating deep inside the ship's hangar deck amidst piles of torpedoes and fuel. The resulting explosion was apocalyptic. It blew the massive elevator platform 1,000 feet into the air. The St. Lo, a veteran of the morning's miracle, was torn in half. She sank in less than 30 minutes, taking over 100 men with her. The survivors of the St. Lo joined the hundreds of others already floating in the oil-slicked waters from the Johnston, the Hull, and the Samuel B. Roberts. For the men in the water, the battle for survival had shifted from a fight against steel giants to a fight against the elements and biology. Approximately 1,200 Americans were drifting in the open ocean. Most were covered in thick black fuel oil, which clung to their skin, blinded their eyes, and induced violent vomiting when swallowed. The oil, however, was a double-edged sword. While it was toxic, it also protected them from the scent of blood that attracted predators. Those outside the oil slicks were not so lucky. The waters off Samar were infested with sharks. As the sun reached its zenith, the sharks began to circle. The men formed tight groups, linking arms in floater nets or clinging to debris, kicking their legs frantically whenever a fin sliced the water nearby. The screams of men being pulled under punctuated the long, hot afternoon. Thirst became the new enemy. The tropical sun baked the sailors, blistering their skin. Tongues swelled in their mouths until they could barely speak.
Hallucinations set in. Men began to see things that weren't there, ships on the horizon, islands with fresh water, even diners serving iced tea. Some, driven mad by dehydration, broke the cardinal rule of the sea and drank the salt water. Delirium followed quickly, then death. In one heartbreaking instance, a sailor hallucinated that the ship's store was open just below the waves. He unclipped his life vest and swam down to buy a soda, never to return. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, the captain of the Samuel B. Roberts, floated among his men, his own eyes swollen shut from the oil and the sun. He spent the hours talking to them, keeping them awake, reminding them of who they were. "Your Navy men, hold on," he rasped. He led them in prayers and songs, their cracked voices drifting over the empty Pacific. They watched night fall, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold that made their teeth chatter uncontrollably. Then came the next day and the next. Due to a series of communication errors and the confusion of the wider battle, the Navy command didn't realize exactly where the survivors were. They were drifting alone in the middle of a war zone. It wasn't until nearly 50 hours after their ships had gone down that salvation appeared. An American infantry landing craft, cruising the area on a patrol, spotted the oil slick and the bobbing heads. The rescue operation was frantic. Men who had held on to life for a thread for 2 days suddenly let go once they knew they were safe, their bodies giving out from the accumulated trauma. Strong arms pulled the oil-blackened survivors onto the decks of rescue ships. They were unrecognizable, more like statues of tar than human beings. One sailor pulled onto a hospital ship, was asked his name. He couldn't remember. He just pointed to the ocean and whispered, "I was on the Johnston." The news of Taffy 3's stand began to filter back to the United States, but it was overshadowed by the larger victory at Leyte Gulf. It would take years for the full magnitude of what happened to be understood. Historians and naval strategists would analyze the battle for decades, running simulations that proved time and again that Taffy 3 should have been annihilated. The survival of the American beachhead was a statistical anomaly. It was attributed not to superior firepower or tactical advantage, but to the sheer aggression of Commander Evans, the tactical brilliance of the destroyer captains who drove their ships like sports cars into the path of battleships, and the pilots who flew until their tanks were dry. The wreck of the Johnston was discovered in 2019, resting over 20,000 feet deep, the deepest shipwreck ever found at the time. It sits upright, its guns still trained on the enemy, a silent monument to the day when tin cans fought like battleships. The battle off Samar remains the U.S. Navy's finest hour, a story not of conquest, but of the refusal to yield. It serves as a permanent reminder to the American people that victory is not always determined by the size of the dog in the fight, but by the size of the fight in the dog. As the sun sets over the Pacific today, the waters off Samar are peaceful, but the echo of that impossible morning, the thunder of the Yamato, and the defiant crack of the Johnston's 5-inch guns resonates forever in the annals of freedom. While the survivors of Taffy 3 were fighting their lonely war against sharks and the sun, a different kind of storm was raging hundreds of miles away, a storm of command, ego, and miscommunication that would haunt the U.S. Navy for decades. To understand the full tragedy of the sacrifice off Samar, one must look to the north, to the heavy hitters of the Third Fleet, and specifically to the Bull. The Bull's Run and the message that changed history. Admiral William Bull Halsey was an American icon, aggressive, brash, and hungry for a fight. He commanded the mighty Third Fleet, the most powerful naval armada on the planet. His orders were to cover the Leyte landings, but he had a loophole in his instructions. If the opportunity arose to destroy a major portion of the Japanese fleet, that became his primary task. The Japanese knew this. They knew Halsey couldn't resist a brawl, so they dangled a bait, a decoy fleet of empty aircraft carriers commanded by Admiral Ozawa, far to the north. These carriers had almost no planes, but Halsey didn't know that. When his scouts spotted them, he saw the prize he had been waiting for. Halsey took the bait. He took everything, all his battleships, all his fast carriers, all his heavy cruisers, and steamed north at full speed to crush the decoys. He left the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. He left Taffy 3 alone. Back at Pearl Harbor, thousands of miles away, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz, was watching the plot board with growing horror. He saw the Japanese center force moving toward Samar. He saw Taffy 3's desperate calls for help, and he saw Halsey's fleet steaming away from the battle. The tension in the headquarters was suffocating. Nimitz, known for his icy calm, finally decided to intervene. He ordered a message sent to Halsey to nudge him back. The message was encrypted. To confuse enemy cryptographers, standard naval procedure required adding nonsense phrases at the beginning and end of the real text. The radio officer at Pearl Harbor typed out the message. As padding for the end, he used a phrase that popped into his head, perhaps inspired by the anniversary of the charge of the Light Brigade. The world wonders. The message was beamed across the Pacific. On Halsey's flagship, the USS New Jersey, the decoder stripped away the beginning nonsense phrase, but in a fateful error, left the ending phrase, thinking it was part of the scolding message. When Halsey was handed the slip of paper, it read like a biting insult from his boss. Where is, repeat, where is Task Force 34? The world wonders. Halsey exploded. He felt humiliated, accused of incompetence in front of his staff. He threw his cap on the deck of the bridge and stomped on it, shouting profanities. It took his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Robert Carney, grabbing his arm and shouting, "Stop it! What the hell is the matter with you? Pull yourself together," to calm him down. For an hour, Halsey seethed, delaying the order to turn around. By the time he finally reversed course and raced south to save Taffy 3, it was too late. The battle was over. The ocean was empty except for the debris and the dying. The World Wonders message would become the most famous signal in naval history, a string of accidental words that psychologically broke a legendary admiral and underscored the tragedy of the men left behind. The mystery of the turn. Meanwhile, on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, a different psychological drama had played out, one that saved the Americans. Why did Admiral Kurita turn back? He had the American carriers in his sights. He had the firepower to wipe out the landing force at Leyte. Victory was minutes away. Historians argue that Kurita was a broken man before the battle even began. 3 days prior, his flagship, the cruiser Otago, had been torpedoed by a U.S. submarine. Kurita had been forced to swim for his life in shark-infested waters, swallowing oil and watching his staff die. He was fished out of the water, shaken and exhausted, and transferred to the Yamato. He hadn't slept in days. When the battle off Samar began, the ferocity of Taffy 3 confused him. The smokescreens laid by the Johnston and the others were so effective that Japanese lookouts couldn't get accurate counts of the American ships. The constant air attacks, though mostly devoid of lethal ordnance, were relentless. Kurita was convinced he was facing the main American fleet, not a handful of escorts. He received a report, later proven false, that American battleships were closing in behind him. Haunted by the memory of Midway, where indecision led to the loss of 4 carriers, and physically depleted from his ordeal in the water, Kurita snapped. He prioritized the survival of his fleet over the destruction of the transports. He ordered the retreat. It was a decision that would be debated in Japanese naval academies for generations. In the end, the ferocity of the tin can sailors had not just damaged ships, it had broken the enemy commander's will to fight. The orphans of the sky. While the ships sank and the commanders raged, there was another group of heroes often forgotten in the chaos. The pilots of Taffy 3 who couldn't return home. When the escort carriers Gambier Bay and St. Lo were sunk and the others were too damaged to recover aircraft, dozens of American planes were left circling in the sky with nowhere to land. These were the orphans, low on fuel, damaged by anti-aircraft fire, and watching their floating runways disappear beneath the waves, they had to make terrible choices. Some pilots, seeing the destroyers in the water picking up survivors, chose to ditch their planes nearby, parachuting into the ocean to join their shipmates in the oil slicks. Others turned their noses toward the Philippines, hoping to make it to the muddy, unfinished airstrip at Tacloban on Leyte Island. Tacloban was barely a runway. It was a strip of mud controlled by the Army, not the Navy. As the Navy planes came sputtering in, running on fumes, they found the strip jammed with traffic. There was no time for protocol. Desperate Avenger and Wildcat pilots ignored the wave-offs and slammed their planes down onto the mud. Some crashed into trees, others collided with parked machinery. It was here, on this muddy strip, that the inter-service rivalry between the Army and Navy evaporated. Army mechanics rushed to pull Navy pilots from their cockpits. They fueled Navy planes with Army gas and armed them with Army bombs. For the rest of the day, Taffy 3 pilots flew sorties from a muddy Army field, returning to the battle to drop bombs on the retreating Japanese, fueled by rage and the need to protect their brothers still floating in the water. The long shadow. When the war ended less than a year later, the battle off Samar began its transition from news to legend. But for the survivors, the battle never really ended. Commander Ernest Evans of the Johnston became a mythic figure. His Medal of Honor citation is one of the chilling documents in military history. But his family in Oklahoma remembered him not as a warrior, but as a man who knew he wasn't coming back. Before he sailed, he had told his crew, "I will never retreat." He kept that promise. He was the first Native American in the U.S. Navy to be awarded the Medal of Honor. The survivors formed the Taffy 3 Association. For decades, they met annually. They weren't the tall, chiseled figures of recruitment posters. They were postmen, mechanics, teachers, and farmers. At their reunions, they didn't brag. They toasted the empty chairs. They spoke of the sound of the Yamato's guns, a sound they said felt like a physical punch to the chest, even from miles away. The legacy of the battle reshaped the U.S. Navy. It was the final nail in the coffin of the battleship era. The Yamato, the greatest battleship ever built, had been chased away by destroyers and airplanes. It proved that speed, technology, and air power were the future. But more importantly, it codified a cultural ethos for the American Navy, the idea that the ship is expendable, but the mission is not. In the end, the story of the battle off Samar is the story of the ultimate American underdog. It is the real-life version of a script that Hollywood would reject as too unrealistic. A group of reservists and rookies sailing in ships made of thin steel stood in the path of an empire's last gasp. They looked at the horizon, saw death approaching, and decided to charge. As the years pass and the last of the survivors fade away, the ocean off Samar remains. The waves roll over the spot where the Johnston lies in the crushing dark, 3 miles down. But if one listens closely to the history, beneath the roar of the Pacific, you can still hear the faint crackling order of Commander Evans echoing through time. All stations, flank speed, stand by to fire. The longest night. As the adrenaline of the battle faded into the blackness of the second night, the ocean became a psychological torture chamber. The physical threat of the sharks was constant. The survivors could feel the rough sandpaper skin of the predators brushing against their legs in the dark, but the mental disintegration was worse. The men of Taffy 3 were entering a state of delirium known as saltwater madness. Aboard the rafts and floater nets of the Samuel B. Roberts Group, the line between reality and nightmare dissolved. One sailor, convinced he was back in his hometown, angrily demanded to know why the bus was late. Another, a young signalman, suddenly pointed into the pitch-black void and shouted that he saw a diner. "They have chocolate milkshakes," he whispered, his voice rasped by salt and oil. "I'm going to get one." Before his shipmates could stop him, he unhooked his life vest and swam away into the dark. He did not scream. He simply vanished. The officers tried to maintain order, but even they were succumbing. Lieutenant Commander Copeland, the captain of the Roberts, later recalled the agony of watching his men die, not from wounds, but from despair. He realized that survival was no longer about strength, it was about the will to ignore the hallucinations. When a man started screaming that Japanese submarines were surfacing beneath them to grind them up, Copeland had to physically restrain him, shouting over the phantom noise to keep the group from panicking and scattering, which would mean certain death by the sharks waiting at the perimeter. The angels of the morning. By the morning of the third day, October 27th, the survivors were slipping away. Many were comatose. The fuel oil had burned their eyes shut. Their skin was covered in ulcers from the salt water. They were no longer fighting. They were waiting to die. Then a sound broke the rhythm of the waves. It wasn't the roar of a battleship or the whine of a Zero. It was the chugging of diesel engines. The rescue ships had finally arrived. Patrol craft and infantry landing ships, dispatched after days of confusion about the survivors' location, began to comb the area. When the rescuers looked over the rails, they recoiled in horror. The men in the water didn't look human. They were encased in a thick, hard shell of black oil and blood. Their eyes were swollen shut, their lips cracked and bleeding. The rescue process was brutal. Men were too weak to climb the cargo nets. Sailors from the rescue ships had to dive into the oily, shark-infested water to tie ropes around the survivors and haul them up like dead weight. As they were pulled onto the decks, the hardened oil had to be scrubbed off with kerosene and butter, anything to dissolve the tar. The pain of the scrubbing was excruciating, peeling away layers of sun-baked skin, but it was the first step back to the living world. For some, the rescue came moments too late. Sailors died on the decks of the rescue ships within minutes of being pulled from the water, their bodies finally giving up the struggle once they knew they were safe. They were buried at sea that same afternoon, sewn into canvas sacks, sliding back into the ocean they had just fought so hard to escape. The gunner mate who wouldn't quit. As the survivors were debriefed, stories of individual heroism began to emerge that were so extraordinary they defied belief. One story that circulated in hushed tones was that of gunner's mate 3rd Class Paul Henry Carr, the gun captain of the aft 5-inch gun mount on the Samuel B. Roberts. During the height of the battle, Carr's mount had fired nearly all of its 300 rounds at the Japanese heavy cruisers. The gun barrel grew so hot it blistered the paint off the steel. When the order to abandon the ship was finally given, a rescue party went to the gun mount to get the crew out. They found the mount torn open by a Japanese shell. Most of the crew was dead. Paul Carr was found at his station, his body torn apart from the waist down. He was holding the last 54-pound shell in his arms, trying to load it into the breech. He didn't know he was dying. He only knew there was one shell left, and as long as there was a shell, he had a job to do. He died with the shell in his arms. Years later, a guided missile frigate would be named the USS Carr in his honor, but in the immediate aftermath, his story served as a reminder to the survivors. They had been part of a crew where men simply refused to stop fighting, even after death had already claimed them. The deepest grave. The story of Taffy 3 did not end in 1944. It continued into the 21st century, shifting from the memories of old men to the cutting edge of deep-sea exploration. For 75 years, the ships of Taffy 3 lay undisturbed in the darkness of the Philippine Trench, their exact location lost to the fog of war.
In 2019 and subsequent years, explorer Victor Vescovo and his team descended into the abyss in a specialized submersible. They were hunting for the Johnston and the Samuel B. Roberts. They found them. The depth was staggering. The Samuel B. Roberts was found resting at 22,621 feet, over 4 miles down. It is the deepest shipwreck ever identified. To put that in perspective, the Titanic lies at about 12,500 feet. The Sammy B is nearly twice as deep. When the submersible's lights cut through the eternal blackness, the cameras revealed a scene frozen in violence. The Johnston was sitting upright. The hull numbers 557 were still visible, preserved by the lack of oxygen at that extreme depth. But the damage told the true story. The bridge was shattered. The gun turrets were trained to the side, still locked in their final firing positions. There were holes punched through the steel that were clean and precise, the signature of armor-piercing shells from battleships meant to sink aircraft carriers, passing straight through the thin skin of the destroyer without exploding. Seeing the ships in the high-definition gloom brought a new wave of reverence. These were not just wrecks, they were crime scenes of a massacre and monuments to a miracle. The images proved that the stories the survivors told of being point-blank with the giants were not exaggerations. They had stood toe-to-toe with the monsters of the sea, and the scars on the ocean floor proved it. The legacy of the tin can sailor. The battle off Samar changed the American naval psyche. It proved that technology and tonnage are secondary to the human spirit. The tin can sailors became a distinct breed in naval lore, men who lived on ships that rolled 45 degrees in a storm, who had no armor, no privacy, and no glory, yet they stood their ground when the entire world seemed to turn against them. Decades later, at a reunion, a survivor was asked if he was afraid during the charge. He paused, looking at his hands that loaded guns, fought fires, and pushed away sharks. "We were terrified," he admitted, "but we were more afraid of letting down the guy standing next to us." That bond was the true weapon of Taffy 3. The Japanese fleet was a hierarchy of obedience. The American fleet was a brotherhood of trust. When Commander Evans turned the Johnston north, he didn't need to explain why. His crew followed him into the fire, not because they were ordered, but because they trusted him. Today, if you visit the U.S. Naval Academy, the battle off Samar is taught not just as a tactical study, but as a lesson in character. It teaches young officers that there is no such thing as a hopeless situation. It teaches that impossible is just an opinion. And it reminds the world that on one October morning, a small group of Americans, armed with nothing more than courage and 5-inch guns, looked the apocalypse in the eye and didn't blink. The horizon off Samar is empty now. The oil is gone. The screams have faded. But for those who know where to look, and for those who remember, the water is hallowed ground. It is the resting place of the giants and the eternal patrol of Taffy 3.
The confusion of empires. When the smoke finally cleared and the war ended in 1945, the true scale of the miracle off Samar was revealed not on the ocean, but in the interrogation rooms of Tokyo. As American naval intelligence officers sat down with surviving Japanese commanders to piece together the battle, a profound confusion took hold. The Japanese officers, meticulous in their records, insisted they had engaged a massive American task force. They drew maps showing heavy cruisers and full-sized fleet carriers. They described the volume of fire and the ferocity of the attacks as consistent with capital ships. When the American interrogators corrected them, sliding the papers back across the table to reveal that the heavy cruisers were actually 2,000-ton destroyers, and the fleet carriers were slow, unarmored merchant hulls converted into escort carriers, the Japanese officers were stunned into silence. They simply could not believe it.
The disparity was so great that it didn't compute. They had been routed by a phantom fleet. The realization was humiliating, yet it bred a strange, grudging respect. The Japanese Imperial Navy, steeped in the code of Bushido, recognized that the spirit shown by the men of Taffy 3 was the very essence of the warrior ethos they claimed to monopolize. The tin can sailors had not just outfought them, they had outspirited them. The martyrdom of the Gambier Bay. In the tragedies of that day, the fate of the USS Gambier Bay stands as a singular, terrifying event in the history of naval warfare. She holds the grim distinction of being the only American aircraft carrier in World War II to be sunk by enemy surface gunfire. Carriers are designed to kill from a distance, over the horizon. They are never meant to see the whites of the enemy's eyes. But on that morning, the Gambier Bay was hunted like a wounded animal. As the Japanese cruisers Chikuma and Tone closed in, the Gambier Bay was shrouded in squalls of rain and smoke, but the wind betrayed her, blowing the smoke away and leaving her exposed under the merciless tropical sun. The Japanese gunners found their range. The first shells punched through the flight deck and the hull. There was no armor to stop them. The ship shuddered violently as the engine rooms flooded, cutting her speed to a crawl. On the flight deck, men were screaming, not in panic, but in frustration. They fired pintle-mounted .50 caliber machine guns at the Japanese cruisers, a gesture of defiance comparable to throwing stones at a tank. As the ship began to list and the order came to abandon ship, the Japanese ships were so close that the Americans could see the Japanese officers on the bridges watching them. Yet as the Gambier Bay capsized and slipped beneath the waves, the Japanese did not machine gun the survivors in the water, a common atrocity in the Pacific War. Perhaps they were too focused on the other ships, or perhaps the sheer audacity of the carrier's resistance had bought the swimming men a moment of grace. The silence of the Admiral. On the other side of the history books, the Japanese commander, Admiral Takeo Kurita, survived the war. He retreated into a quiet, almost monastic life in Japan. For decades, he refused to speak about the battle. He gave no interviews, wrote no memoirs, and attended no reunions. He lived with the crushing knowledge that he had turned away from a decisive victory because he had been bluffed by a handful of destroyers. It wasn't until late in his life, when asked by a journalist why he had retreated, that he offered a glimpse into his soul. He admitted that he was exhausted, yes, but he also spoke of a strange sensation that day, a feeling that the Americans were fighting with a supernatural fury. He had been fighting a war of calculation. Taffy 3 had been fighting a war of survival. The calculation failed. The survival instinct prevailed. Kurita died in 1977, taking the full reasoning for his retreat to his grave, leaving behind the legacy of a man who blinked when he should have struck. The Eternal Patrol. Today, the story of Taffy 3 has transcended history to become folklore. It is the ultimate hold-the-line story. In the mess halls of modern destroyers, the name Johnston is spoken with a reverence usually reserved for saints. The phrase "the world wonders," the accidental insult that spurred Halsey to turn around, remains a cautionary tale about communication and ego. But the most lasting image is not of the ships, but of the men. It is the image of Commander Evans, shirtless and bleeding, missing fingers, standing on the fantail of his burning ship, shouting orders into a broken voice tube. It is the image of the boys in the water, holding each other up as the sharks circled. They were ordinary Americans, high school dropouts, farm boys, city kids, thrust into an impossible situation. They didn't have the biggest guns. They didn't have the fastest ships. They didn't have a chance. But they had something the battleships of the Empire didn't count on. They had each other. And in the end, that was enough.
The tin cans are gone, dissolved into the iron-rich silt of the Philippine Trench, but the standard they set flies high on every mast in the United States Navy. They proved that when the odds are zero and the end is certain, the American sailor does not run. He turns his rudder hard over, sounds the collision alarm, and charges straight into the thunder.